Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the SugarCube format for Twine. In this video, I would like to continue my series on adapting the board game Source of the Nile, and in particular, I would like to talk about escaping from captivity after losing a battle and being captured. So you can see that I've set up an expedition here, and we've gotten into a fight. We've had a couple of specialists killed. We had a doctor and a missionary with us, but they both got killed in the battle, and we were taken prisoner. Now, this is all stuff that we've looked at before and explained how it works before, but we've also got some new stuff. We have these red messages. It says your enemies take you prisoner and you escape after 5 days. And then we have this quite extensive set of messages that are in red, which is my code for messages that I'm only keeping while I'm testing the game. So in other words, in the final version of the game, if this were to happen, you'd only get these two and then these and then these. But these are messages for testing, and it says people rolled 4, muskets rolled 5, rations rolled 4, horses rolled 2, and so on and so on. Obviously, you might guess that these were rolling to see what you escaped with, if anything, and you'd be correct. And you might guess that the rolls didn't go very well, because if we look at the expedition's sort of character sheet, as it were, we can see that there's nothing there except for the explorer themselves. Well, there's no people, no rations, no equipment, just a lone explorer in the wilderness. So that's what it does. Let's have a look at the code. So this is going to be quite similar to the code that we looked at for escaping immediately after a battle. So when you lose a battle, the computer simulates rolling a die, and you have a 1 in 6 chance of just being killed, a 1 in 6 chance of being captured, which is what we're dealing with today, and a 1 in 6 chance of escaping immediately. And if you escape immediately, you roll to see what you escape with, if anything. And similarly, if you are captured, you roll to see what you escape with. And it's quite similar, but I made some changes based on what I thought was realistic and what I thought was sort of fair to the player as well. Whether those are the right decisions, we don't know. I couldn't just adapt the rules as written, because the rules as written and the original game assumes that you have a single explorer, whereas this version that I'm making, you can have multiple specialists with you. So, for example, in what I just showed you, we had a doctor and a missionary that was with us, the player character, the explorer. So when you roll and it says, oh, you escape with a musket and 9 rations, does that mean 1 musket? Or does that mean 1 musket for each specialist that escapes? Which, in that particular case, because they were all killed apart from the explorer, it wouldn't have been a difference. But if the missionary and the doctor had been alive, would that mean 1 musket or 3 muskets? So that's not answered in the original rules, because the original rules don't consider the possibility that you might have more than 1 specialist or more than one sort of explorer, I suppose. So let's have a look at what I did. Well, there aren't any new variables that I need to tell you about. I do need to remind you in particular of the variable $ES. So if you've been following this series, you'll know that when you are defeated, if you are captured, if you have a missionary, they preach to your captors, and if you have a doctor, they will attempt to treat the people in the village where you're captured. And the results of this might make the attitude of your captors change, usually for the better. Usually it makes them more friendly to you. Obviously, in the fiction of the game, they're not completely friendly because they're holding you prisoner. But obviously, if if they're interested in what the missionary has to say, or they can see that the doctor has medical skills, well, they might warm to you a little, perhaps give you a bit more freedom, perhaps, and that might help you escape sooner, and it might help you escape with more stuff, or at least so it seemed. That seemed realistic to me, and that variable of the effect of the preaching and the treating is stored in $ES. You notice this big arrow going up here? Well, let's explain that. This sort of starting from there, all these pages along here in a horizontal line, these are the main course of the turn, I suppose. And normally the turn will go, you can see that most of them just go to the one to the right, and then eventually, of course, we'll loop round and start again. And one of the things that happens is we need to check what's happening to any sick people. Do they die? Do they get better? Do they just stay sick? And we need to do that down here as well. I decided that it wasn't realistic to have characters escaping if they're sick, because in this game, if you're sick, you don't just sort of have a flu. You're seriously at death's door. You have a fever or something that might kill you, something like that. And so it didn't seem realistic to have them escape. I didn't want to give the player the option of abandoning sick people. I might give that option later. Perhaps you can abandon sick people, and that gives you a loss of victory points. But for now, if you have anyone sick, you have to wait till they're sick, and you have to roll to see if they get better. So we need this code for sickness. We need to refer to it in two separate places. And when you need to refer to code in two separate places, you do that with include. So I took the code from sickness. This was used to be quite a big page, but I took most of the code that deals with rolling to see if anyone dies or gets better or whatever. I took all that, I pasted it into a new page called recovery, and then I put include recovery in there, and then that allows me to put include recovery in here as well. But we won't get, because on this page, in the main course of the game, we would then continue on to these pages, and that's not what we want to do with escaping from captivity. We want to treat that as the start of a new turn, I've decided, and we're going to have special. I need to code other pages before I quite do this, but it's going to be basically a new turn with reduced movement points, and you have to be reckless because in the fiction of the game, you're trying to get away from your captors as quickly as possible, and that means you choose to, you move at the fastest possible pace. It doesn't make sense that you would escape and then sort of move slowly and cautiously, or at least I didn't think it would. So that's why we've got that long big arrow going up to recovery. So let's have a look down here. So we've already dealt with after defeat, you might be taken prisoner. If there's if there's a missionary, the missionary will preach. If there's a doctor, the doctor will try and treat the sick. Either of these might change the variable $ES, otherwise it'll be 0. And then we have prisoner 3 and prisoner 4. Prisoner 3 deals with if anyone's sick, and then once we've resolved that, either everyone's dead or they've got better or there wasn't anyone sick to start with, then we deal with your escape and how long it takes you to escape and what you take with you, if anything. So let's have a look at this one, prisoner 3. We set Z to 0, and we're going to see if anyone is unwell. We have a for loop that goes from 0 to c.length -1. And if this code is true, then we set Z equal to 1. So if this code is true, that means that someone is sick. So let's have a look at this code. So we have if $SY if $S square bracket $Y n square bracket is over 0 and either Y is equal to 0 or $P square bracket $Y n square bracket is equal to 1, then we set Z to 1. So what does that mean? Well, if Y is 0, we're dealing with the player character. The player character is always there, because if the player character dies, then the game immediately ends. The you character, the point of view character, the avatar, whatever, if they die, of course the game ends immediately. So for other specialists, they're not always there, and we have the $P array to keep track of whether a given type of specialist is present. So if $P3 is equal to 1, then that means that the third type of specialist, you have a representative of them in your expedition. You can never have more than one. And $S keeps track of whether they are sick. Again, $S0, there is no $P0, but there is a $S0 because the player character can be sick. If $S0 is not 0, that means that the player character is sick. If $S3 is not 0, that means that the third type of specialist is sick, and so on. Now, you might say, well, hang on, how can SY be greater than 0, but PY wouldn't if SY was greater than 0, meaning that specialist was sick, wouldn't that mean that $PY had to be equal to 1, meaning that the specialist was present? How can they be sick but not in the expedition? Well, in the fiction of the game, they can't be sick and not in the expedition. But the reason that could happen is you might have a character who was present, so that particular slot of P was 1. Then they became sick. Then they died, meaning that $P, that slot in $P was set to 0. But that doesn't alter the slot in $S. It probably should. I probably should have said set PZ to 0 and set SZ to 0, but I didn't. I just set PZ to 0. So if you have a character that's been in the expedition but died, they might still have SY greater than 0, but that doesn't mean you need to check what happens to them because they're already dead. So that's why we have both those. So if a given character, if any character is both present and sick, then we set Z to 1. And if Z is equal to 1, we do all this. If Z is not equal to 1, then that means there's no one sick, and we just move on to prisoner 4. So let's have a look at what happens if Z is equal to 1. Well, first of all, we set T++. That means a day passes. T is the array that keeps track of time. And each, like if T is 5, that means it's day 5. And there's a note saying, have to spend the day seeing whether unwell characters heal. In this game, each turn is a day, and it's probably quite unrealistic to have characters getting sick and then dying or getting better after a couple of days. I mean, it could happen. That did happen. You know, remembering that we're not dealing with modern medicine here in modern hospitals. We're dealing with people in the 19th century in often perhaps the wilderness, or in this case in a village where conditions might not be, you know, very hygienic by modern standards. But sometimes people in real life, you might expect people to be sick for weeks and weeks. But that's not very exciting to just continually be, because you're not making any choices here. You're just continually clicking basically to see whether they get better. So I've sort of everything's sped up, I suppose, compared to how real life would work. So if that's the case, we set T++, we include recovery, and I'll briefly go through recovery. I have gone through that code before in detail, but I'll go through what it does at least, rather than go through every line. Then, if P0 exclamation mark equals, which means does not equal, if $P0 does not equal -1, then we have a button, and the button says continue and takes you to prisoner 3, i.e. essentially takes you to the top of this page. So what does P0 not equal to -1 mean? Well, when the player character dies, then P0 is set to -1. That's just my way of letting the game know, yeah, the player character's dead, nothing else is going to happen. So if P0 is equal to -1 in this thing, then nothing more would happen. You just go through this, and in recovery, you'd get a message saying you have died. And then there wouldn't be any button to continue, of course, because you don't continue after you're dead. And so, of course, once we click this button, we'd go back to prisoner 3, and again, it would check if anyone was sick, and if they were, we would go through this code again. And that's going to keep going until no one's sick, and then if no one's sick, Z will be equal to 0, and therefore we'll end up in this else, and we'll go to prisoner 4. So before we go to prisoner 4, let's very briefly look at recovery. Recovery has a few parts. One, If there's a doctor and the doctor is well, then that gives you -1 to every die roll. -1 rather than +1, because in this case, lower die rolls are better. Then we go through each possible person, checking, for simplicity's sake, so far, I've decided that only Europeans get sick, which of course isn't really true. Only the doctor, the missionary, and the player character can get sick, because if the other character, if like the guards and the scout and stuff that you can hire, if they get sick, they just desert you, so they're sort of gone straight away. So we go through each one of those, and if they are sick, we roll a die, we apply modifiers, including the modifier for the doctor, and then we apply these results. 2 or less, as you can see, lower rolls are better. 2 or less, you're fine. 3, you change to improving, which gives you a bonus for subsequent rolls. 4, nothing. And 5 or 6, you die. And you can see there that if the player character dies, we set P0 to -1, so that's why we've got that if P0 equals -1 in the other page. And if a specialist dies, then we set PZ to 0. We don't set SZ to 0. We could do that. It might be a better practice to do that, but I decided not to, and that's why we've got that check of both P and S. That's why we've got that sort of slightly counterintuitive check there. Anyway, let's look at prisoner 4. Everyone is well, and so you eventually escape. So in this, realistically, of course, you could be a prisoner for months, but that's not very fun. And realistically, you could be killed as you were escaping, but I decided that's not very fun either, because you might spend 3 or 4, you might have 3 or 4 goes going through prisoner 3, going, well, the missionary's still sick, oh, the missionary's still sick, the missionary's still sick, the missionary's dead. Right now you can try and escape. If you then clicked and it went, oh, you died, it seems like those previous days would seem like, well, you didn't get, you don't get any choices in those days, and it would sort of seem a bit rough, I think, to have you have all of these clicking with no choices, and then eventually, oh, you're dead anyway. So those clicks were sort of pointless. So I decided to change that from the original rules. You will escape, and well, that's part of the original rule. You will successfully escape, and you won't die trying to escape. In the original rules, you will eventually escape, which isn't realistic. You could be prisoners for years, of course, in real life. You will eventually escape, and you'll live. The other specialists, if any of them they won't die in the escape either, which again is not realistic. It's just giving the player a bit of a break. So here's what we do. We need to find how long does it take to escape, and how what do we end up escaping with. So we set Z equals random 6. We have that red message that tells you what you rolled. And here we see the first example of $ES having an effect. Z becomes math.max bracket 2 or Z minus ES. So if ES is over 0, then you're going to get a bonus to the days to escape. So if you roll a 2 and ES is 1, well, it'll go down to 1. Or if you roll a 4, it'll go down to 3 or whatever it is. But it takes you at least 2 days to escape. It seemed a bit unrealistic that you could escape in 1 day. That seemed a bit easy, so I changed it to math.max, which means the higher of 2 or Z minus ES. So if Z minus ES is below 2, if it's 1 or 0 or -1, etc., then it's still 2 days. We set T equals T plus Z. Well, T is time. So, of course, if it takes you 4 days to escape, well, it should be 4 days later, shouldn't it? Just as if you spend a day seeing whether the characters heal. I don't know if I mentioned this, I might have glossed over this, but every time you include recovery, before you do that, we set T++. In other words, we increment the time by 1. Back to this. And having escaped, the rest of the code, most of the rest, like it's quite a long page. Most of the rest of this is deciding what you escape with. In the original rules, it's a simple roll on a single roll on a table. I've decided to be more complicated because it's a computer. You can have 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 rolls, and that's fine. It just takes a fraction of a second, and it gives you more possibilities for results, and so that's probably a good way to go, or at least so I thought. So we go through all of the different types of things that we escape with, and they are stored in $EX. $EX is an array that is basically the sort of almost the character sheet of the expedition. It that's an explanation. That just tells you it's the stats of the expedition. CEN for their names. So EX1 is how many horses you have, how many camels, how many canoes. EX4 is how many scouts. EX5 is how many guards. EX6 is bearers. 7 is muskets. 8 is gifts. And 9 is rations. So most of how you're doing is stored in the EX array. EX, of course, standing for expedition. So let's have a look. We set EX8 to 0. We set EX4, 5, and 6 to 0. EX8 is, I think, gifts. EX4, 5, and 6 are people. And we set this variable GO to 0. That is where the scout comes from. If you have a scout, because you can only ever have one scout, you also keep track of where they come from, because that makes a slight difference in terms of dealing with locals. If they're from nearby, you get a small bonus, basically, which we've talked about in a previous video. Okay, so we set those to 0. And there's a little note saying scout, guards, and bearers are considered to be gone forever. If escape with any, they are considered to be from the settlement. So if you escape and you have a guard or a bearer, that's considered to be someone from the village that you've sort of made friends with and have convinced to come with you in the fiction of the game. So we generate a random number. We add ES and subtract 2. Now, why do we add ES and subtract 2? Well, because in the original version of this game, you're rolling on a table but subtracting 2 from the result. And then you're applying the results of your preaching and your treating as a modifier. Now, what I could have done, instead of saying set Z equals random 1 to 6 and then saying subtract 2, I could have said set Z equal to that, a random number from -1 to 4. That gives exactly the same results, of course, as doing 1 to 6 and then subtracting 2. But I thought it was a bit clearer what's happening in terms of the original rules if I did it in the long form. So we set it equal to 1 to 6, and then we subtract 2 and add $ES. Then we have a for loop, and the for loop goes from 5 to Z. So if this result isn't at least 5, well, we're not going to go through this for loop. And the for loop says if random 1 to 2 is equal to 1, so in other words, a 50% chance that we set $EX random 4 to 6 plus plus. What does that mean? Well, EX4, EX5, and EX6 are the scouts, guards, and bearers, respectively. So you've convinced a random person to come with you. And then we set EX4 equal to math.min 1 or EX4. What that means is set it to the smaller of either 1 or its current value. In other words, if it's 2, lower it to 1. So if you are very lucky, this number, the Z ends up being 7 or 8 or something, because you did really well setting up ES. In other words, the priest and the doctor or the doctor did really well. And let's say you get a lot of these 50% chances and you end up getting 2 scouts. It's very unlikely, but it could happen. Well, we just ignore the second one. You can only ever have one scout. That's just a rule of the original rules, and I've kept it. It's not terribly realistic, but there it is. That's the rule. If after that you have a scout, then we set GO equal to $I. $I is how far you are inland. $GO is, as I say, where the guide It actually stands for guide origin, because in the original game, what we call scouts are called guides. So, of course, they're going to come from where you currently are because they're from this village. So then we go with muskets. Very similar. Random 1 to 6. Add ES minus 2. And then we make a decision based on the number. If the number is less than 4, then we set EX7, which is the number of muskets, to 0. Otherwise, we have a 50% chance of setting it to the smaller of its current value, or 1. So in other words, you will have 1 musket unless you didn't have any to start with. And the reason for that is because these locals don't have muskets. So if you have a musket, you're stealing it from them. But sorry, yeah, if you get a musket, you're getting your own musket back. It's considered that the locals don't have any muskets, and so if you get one, it has to be one that you already had and that they took when they captured you. In the fiction of the game, perhaps you've learnt that they're storing it in such and such a place because they don't know what it is, so they're just putting it in this other, they're not guarding it or something, whatever, right? You've managed to get it back. Otherwise, if that random 1 to 2 is not the case, and if Z is not less than 4, then it is the smaller of the current number of muskets you have, or P0 plus 1 plus EX5. So what does that mean? Well, P0 is the number of specialists present, 1 for the yourself character, and EX5 is the number of guards. So everyone in this option, everyone who can take a musket takes 1 musket, assuming that you have that many muskets, right? So if you rolled low, you don't get any. Otherwise, 50% chance of you get 1 musket, or you get 1 for each person who can use a musket. But in both cases, it's capped by the number that you already have. And that is why EX7 is not set to 0 when we're setting these other ones to 0. We don't set EX7 to 0 because we need to know what EX7 is when we're rolling to see how the muskets work. Now, we do something very similar for rations, except that rations are not going to be capped at what you had because you're stealing food from your captors. Your captors will have food. They will have smoked fish or cured meat or some sort of good rations like that you can take that won't spoil. So we set a dice roll. We tell the player, or at least we tell them in this testing phase, we will remove this when in the final game. We add ES and we subtract 2. And again, if Z is less than 4, you got no rations. Otherwise, if random 1 to 2 is equal to 1, you've got 1 to 6 plus 1 to 6 plus 2. So 2 dice plus 2. Otherwise, we have a loop that goes from 1 to P0 plus 1 plus EX6. What's that mean? Well, that's P0 is the number of specialists, as I said, 1 for the player character, and EX6 is this time the number of bearers. In this game, guards are assumed to be very sort of proud warriors. They won't demean themselves by carrying stuff. They won't ever act as bearers. Europeans don't have that same sort of inhibition. I mean, I don't know how realistic that is, but in this version, you're sort of fairly practical. And so you will steal a load of rations from the storehouse. The bearers will do it, but these proud warriors, they won't do it. No, I only hunt. I don't do sort of menial work. I do only warriors' work. So again, if it's a low number, you get nothing. Otherwise, you have a 50% chance of getting one person steals, a load of rations, or everyone who can carry one steals a load of rations. Then we roll for horses. You can only steal back your own horses is the note there. Very similar. This is all going to be sort of variants on a theme, right? 1 to 6, tell the player, add ES and subtract 2. Then generate another number from 1 to 6, tell the player, if Y, this random number, is less than or equal to Z minus 4. So the higher this one is, the more chance you have. This minus 4 essentially becomes your chance out of 6 to get any horses. If that's the case and you had some horses to start with, EX1 is how many horses you have, then there's a random possibility, which is you either get one horse or you get the smaller of how many horses you had, or P0 plus 1 plus EX4 plus EX5 plus EX6. And that sum is everyone who can ride a horse. All the specialists, P0, that's how many specialists are stored in P0. The other slots of P are whether an individual specialist is present. But P0 is the total number of specialists, plus 1 for you, and then plus EX4, EX5, and EX6, which is the guards, bearers, and the scout, or the scout, guards, and bearers, respectively. So they'll all ride horses. So in other words, if you roll high enough, or you roll high enough with Z and low enough with Y, and you had at least some horses, then you steal back either one horse, one person manages to get a horse, or everyone who can ride gets a horse, capped at the number of horses you actually have. And if that's the case, if you get horses, I've assumed that we're now looking at horses, camels, and canoes, and I've assumed that if you get horses, you don't get camels or a canoe. Because it seems realistic enough that you might be able to sneak over to the horses, get on them and ride away, but it doesn't seem realistic to me that you'd get on the horses and get them and then get canoes as well and then get camels as well. So it's a maximum of one mode of transport, I suppose. We set EX2 equal to 0. We set EX3 equal to 0. If we got horses, then we set EX2 and 3 to 0. Otherwise, we didn't get any horses, did we? So we set EX1 to 0. We have a note that says we didn't get any horses. Now let's see if we get camels. Now this works exactly very similar. We've got the 1 to 6, tell the player, add ES, subtract 2, generate another number. If Y is less than or equal to Z minus 4, and either EX2 is over 0, i.e. you already have camels, or the terrain is desert. Because if you're in the desert, we're assuming that the assumption in the game is that tribes in the desert do have camels, but tribes in other terrains don't have horses. So if you're in the desert, yeah, you can steal their camels, and serves them right for capturing you and fighting you, I guess. Or if you're anywhere else, you can steal back your own camels. Presumably they'll keep the camels for long enough for you to get them back. And again, if random 1 to 2 is equal to 1, then you're only able to escape with one camel. Otherwise, if the terrain is desert, then everyone gets a camel. P0 plus 1 plus EX4 plus EX5 plus EX6. Otherwise, so the terrain is not desert and this random 1 to 2 didn't come up, then EX2 equals math.min, EX2 or this number. So in this case, where terrain is not desert, you steal back as many camels as you had, up to sort of 1 each. And if that's the case, we set EX3 to 0. If you've got camels, then you don't have canoes, which is EX3, and we've already said you don't have horses. If we're in this code, we've already set EX1 to 0. Otherwise, well, you didn't get camels. Now let's see if you get canoes. So I've decided quite arbitrarily that you'll go for camels before canoes if given the option. That may not be true, but that's what it is for now. This works very, very similarly, except that it's not about whether you're in the desert, it's about whether you're next to a river. So we set EX2 equal to 0, which is the number of canoes. So in this case, it's not based on stealing back your own canoes. You're going to be either stealing theirs or it's not relevant. So if TE2I is greater than 0, what does that mean? Well, if TE2I is greater than 0, that means there's water nearby. So all of this code is only going to happen if there's water nearby. If there's water nearby, hey, look at that. Random 1 to 6 plus ES minus 2, so the same thing we're doing as before. And then another random number. and if y is less than or equal to z minus 4, then ex3 is a random number between 1 and 1 plus p0 plus ex6. 1 plus p0 plus ex6 is u plus all the specialists plus all the bearers. So apparently setting up canoes and paddling them, well, that's not warriors' work either. So the guards won't do it, and presumably the scout won't do it either. Only the sort of Europeans and the bearers will lower themselves to doing this. And so it's between one canoe and one for each of you. So the maximum you can get away with is one each, if you're very lucky, and the minimum is 0. Otherwise, if this is not the case, then we set ex3 to 0. And as we saw in the example, it's very difficult because, remember, z is a number from 1 to 6, so that's going to be about 3.5. If es is a low number, remember that we're minusing 2, so 3.5 minus 2, that's like 1.5, plus 0. So we're going to be about 2 or 3. And then we're seeing if a random number from 1 to 6 is less than 2 or 3 minus 4. Well, a random number from 1 to 6 is not 2 or 3 minus 4 is a negative number. So, in other words, unless ES is quite high, unless you impress these guys, unless you impress your captors, they're not going to give you a lot of freedom, I guess, is the thought. And so if you get away, you're going to be lucky to sort of get away with just yourself. You're going to be lucky to have anything other than, just yourself. And so what happened in the example is I think pretty typical. You might get away with a horse or a canoe or something, but most times you perhaps just get away with absolutely nothing. And maybe that will turn out to be a bit harsh, and then we'll have to fix it. But that's how it is now, and it seems realistic to me. And maybe it will turn out that we want to make it a bit. A bit more fun, a bit more, a bit more generous. But we'll see what happens. Anyway, so then we set DE equal to 1. Now, I'm going to explain what that is. I've sort of, I glossed over that it's on a previous page, but I'll explain that. But I'll explain the rest of this page first, and then we'll explain this DE. Then we include classify expedition. That is because, of course, we don't know. We always need to know whether the expedition's on foot or in canoes or on horseback. And if it is on horseback, does it have enough people to deal with all the horses? And if it's on in canoes, how fast are we paddling? Do we have enough people to paddle all the canoes, and so on? So that's what that's going to do. And then I've got a note to myself, because I haven't written classify expedition, I don't quite know where it's going to go next, and I haven't finished the main sequence of the turn. But I've got a note to myself that says, should be the start of a new turn, proceed at a reckless pace, movement points are randomly reduced, for example, perhaps being halved at worst, because don't necessarily escape first thing in the morning. Yeah, okay, so that's fairly straightforward. In other words, if you normally have 20 movement points, you might have only 10 because you didn't get going before the afternoon, and so you don't have as many hours of daylight to travel. And you are automatically proceeding at a reckless pace because, of course, you're trying to get away from these people who have captured you. All right, so let's deal with DE just briefly. DE is a special variable that deals with the sidebar. We have this special name, story caption, and if you have a page named story caption and it's spelt exactly like this, including the capital letters and the lack of a space, then that will do whatever code is in here will happen in the sidebar. And what I've done, as I often do in these projects, is I have the character sheet in the sidebar. So the thing that says day 4, you are moving through desert, you've got this many bearers, this many guards, and so on and so on. And all of this is wrapped within $DE. If $DE is over 0, then do all this stuff, which essentially is printing out the current state of the game. And the reason we want to have this if DE is over 0 is because when we're setting up the expedition, there's no point trying to display what's in the expedition, because we don't have an expedition yet. It would just print out either errors or zeros, and it wouldn't make a lot of sense. So we set DE equal to 0 at the start. We set it equal to 1 when we're ready to set out, and it will mostly stay at 1 for the rest of the game until we win or we die. But when you're in captivity, remember that we haven't, when we go back to this one here, when we're dealing with what you escape with, remember that we haven't set those things to 0 yet, because we don't know what you're going to escape with, and we need to know how much you had for some of the ones, because you can only escape with camels that you have unless you're in the desert, for example. And it didn't seem right when you're in captivity. It didn't seem right to say you have 7 camels, because you're a prisoner. You don't really have 7 camels. In the fiction of the game, there are 7 camels, but you don't really have them. It's the captors that have them. So how did I deal with that? Well, in prisoner, we set DE equal to 2, and that, in story caption, oops, sorry, it does, yeah, actually, that's an example of a thing that happens a lot. Sometimes when you try and move it, there's a sort of an error where it moves it heaps off the screen for some reason. And if that happens, just do undo move passages, and it will move it back. Yeah, it's very annoying, that. Anyway, that will, well, this will still trigger because $DE is greater than 0. But we have this if DE, so how have we done this? If DE is equal to 2, give the message that says you're in captivity. Then we have the table that gives you, we have the main table of this sidebar. Here we're printing all of the specialists that are present, or including yourself, and then we're printing their health. We're saying whether they're well or sick, improving or well. But when we print guards, bearers, camels, horses, gifts, and rations, we do that within an if DE equals 1. If DE is equal to 2, well, obviously it's not equal to 1, so it won't print any of that stuff. So in other words, setting DE equal to 2 will mean that it still tells you how far inland you are. It'll tell you you're in captivity. It'll tell you what terrain, which is what that include terrain does. It'll tell you that you're passing through a forest next to a lake, something like that. It'll tell you what specialist you have, but it won't tell you anything about the guards, rations, and camels that you used to have, because you don't have them anymore. And it'll still tell you your VP, because that's outside of that if. And so that's what setting DE equal to 2 does, and that's why we set it back to 0 once we've decided what you escape with. That's why we set it back to 1, because once we set it back to 1, well, of course, we want to tell them what they escaped with, if anything. So that is escaping. The next thing I'm going to do might be what happens if you meet locals who are friendly. So if you meet locals and you don't end up in a big battle. Otherwise, I might do waterfalls, or what they call cascades, which is a thing that you can discover along the way, which I haven't yet dealt with. But for now, I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.